The October wind carried the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke through the chapel doors, mingling with the perfume of hothouse roses, arranged in extravagant abundance along every pew, their white petals almost obscene in their pristine beauty against the ancient stone walls that had witnessed 3 centuries of vows spoken and promises made. Eleanor Hayes stood at the threshold of St. Michael's Chapel, her gloved hands trembling against the rough oak of the doorframe, her breath catching in her chest like a small wild thing trapped behind her corset stays, and for a moment, just one desperate, cowardly moment, she considered turning away, fleeing down the gravelled path, past the manicured gardens of Thornfield Manor, past the elegant carriages with their restless horses, past all of it until she reached some place where the name Alexander Blackwood had never been spoken, where her heart might remember how to beat without the constant ache that had become as familiar as her own pulse. But she did not flee. She had promised herself this much. She would see it through to the end, would bear witness to the moment when all her silent hopes, those fragile, foolish dreams she had harbored like pressed flowers in the pages of a book, would be sealed away forever beneath the finality of spoken vows. The chapel was filled with the rustle of silk and murmured conversation, ladies in their autumn finery of deep burgundy and forest green, gentlemen in dark mourning coats, all of society assembled to witness what they deemed a most appropriate match, the union of Alexander Blackwood, Master of Thornfield, and Lady Catherine Ashford, whose beauty and breeding were proclaimed suitable to restore warmth to that great house that had known too much sorrow. Eleanor moved like a ghost along the outer aisle, seeking the least conspicuous position, her simple dove-grey dress marking her as what she was, a governess, a woman of no particular consequence, someone whose presence would be noted only if she dared to sit anywhere but in the shadows. She found her place in the last row, partially obscured by a stone pillar worn smooth by centuries of reverent hands, and allowed herself to truly look toward the altar where he stood. Alexander, even from this distance, even with his back turned to the assembled guests, she knew every line of him, the set of his shoulders beneath the fine black coat, the way he held his head with that particular tilt that suggested he was listening to something far away, the dark hair that fell just slightly longer than fashion dictated because he cared nothing for such things. 3 years she had known him, 3 years of proximity that had been both blessing and exquisite torture. And now, in mere minutes, she would watch him pledge himself to another, would hear him speak words of love and devotion to Lady Catherine, and perhaps when it was done, when the impossible fantasy had been thoroughly demolished by the weight of reality, Eleanor's heart might finally learn the wisdom of surrender. 3 years earlier, on a September morning, when the world still held the possibility of remaining a safe and predictable place, Eleanor Hayes had arrived at Thornfield Manor with a single trunk containing all her worldly possessions, a letter of reference from the employment agency clutched in her gloved hand, and a heart carefully fortified against disappointment after 26 years of learning that life offered little room for romantic notions to women in her position. The manor had loomed before her like something from a Gothic tale, all grey stone and mullioned windows, ivy creeping up the eastern wall as if nature itself sought to reclaim what man had built, and she had felt the weight of centuries pressing down upon her shoulders as the housekeeper, Mrs. Brennan, had led her through corridors that smelled of beeswax and old wood, and something else, something like sorrow, if sorrow could be inhaled. Her charge, she was told in hushed tones as they climbed the servants' stairs to the nursery wing, was Miss Charlotte Blackwood, aged 7, orphaned these 6 months past when fever had taken both her parents, come to live with her only living relative, her father's brother, Mr. Alexander Blackwood, who was himself a widower of 2 years and had, according to Mrs. Brennan's carefully neutral tone that nevertheless conveyed volumes, not been the same since Mrs. Blackwood passed, God rest her soul. Eleanor had met Charlotte first, a small, solemn creature with dark curls and eyes that held too much understanding for one so young, who had curtsied politely and answered Eleanor's gentle questions in monosyllables, and Eleanor's heart had cracked open just slightly at the sight of such contained grief in one who should have been running through gardens and laughing at butterflies. It was 3 days before she encountered the master of the house, 3 days during which the servants spoke of him only in whispers, mentioning that he kept to his study, that he took his meals alone, that he had instructed all household business be directed to Mrs. Brennan, And when Eleanor finally did see him emerging from the library as she descended the main staircase with Charlotte, an action she immediately realized was forbidden to governesses who should have kept to the back, passages she had frozen like a startled deer, her hand tightening on Charlotte's small fingers. He was tall, his frame suggesting strength beneath the severe black coat he wore, his face all sharp angles and shadows, dark eyes that swept over her with what seemed like cold assessment, his mouth set in a line that suggested he had forgotten entirely how to smile, and for a moment that stretched into small eternity, they had simply looked at one another, Eleanor's heart hammering against her ribs, while some instinct she did not understand whispered that this man was dangerous, not in any physical sense, but in ways that could prove far more devastating to her carefully constructed peace. "You are the new governess," he had said finally, his voice deep and rough, as though from disuse, and Eleanor had curtsied, managing to reply, "Yes, sir, Eleanor Hayes, at your service." While Charlotte had pressed against her skirts, and Alexander Blackwood had looked down at his niece with an expression that might have been pain or love, or some combination of both, before nodding once, sharply, and saying, "See that Charlotte is well cared for, Miss Hayes. That is all I require." And then he had walked past them, leaving the faint scent of tobacco and something like cedar in his wake, and Eleanor had released a breath she had not known she was holding, telling herself that her trembling was merely the result of having been caught where she should not have been. Nothing more, certainly nothing more. The months passed like a slow thaw, winter yielding reluctantly to spring, and Eleanor discovered that her presence at Thornfield Manor had begun to work changes she had not anticipated, small transformations that accumulated like snowdrops pushing through frozen ground until the entire household seemed to breathe differently. She brought warmth to the nursery wing with her patient lessons, teaching Charlotte not merely letters and numbers but filling their days with stories and songs, with watercolor paintings that captured the gardens in their seasonal changes, with expeditions to collect leaves and stones and feathers that became the subjects of natural philosophy discussions, and slowly, so slowly, Eleanor almost missed the transformation. Charlotte began to smile, to laugh, to run through the corridors with something approaching the carefree joy that should have been her birthright. "Mrs. Brennan remarked upon it one morning as Eleanor descended for breakfast, saying with satisfaction that the child is coming back to herself, Miss Hayes, and it's your doing." But Eleanor felt the credit belonged equally to time, that great healer, and to Charlotte's own resilient spirit that had been waiting only for permission to hope again. What Eleanor did not realize, absorbed as she was in her duties and in the careful management of her own growing attachment to this house and its inhabitants, was that she was being observed, that Alexander Blackwood had taken to pausing in his movements through the manor, stopping at doorways and in corridors where he might catch glimpses of the schoolroom, where he might hear Eleanor's voice reading aloud from adventure tales or explaining the mathematics of music, where he might see Charlotte's animated face as she showed her governess some treasure discovered in the gardens. Their exchanges remained brief, formal encounters in hallways where Eleanor would curtsy and Alexander would nod, inquiries about Charlotte's progress that Eleanor answered with professional precision, but somewhere in the third month of her residence, she noticed that these conversations had begun to extend by sentences, by moments, that he asked not merely, "Is Charlotte well?" but "What are you reading with her?" and "Does she show aptitude for languages?" And once, memorably, I heard her laughing this morning. I had forgotten that sound was possible in this house. It was a Tuesday in late March, when Eleanor experienced the first crack in her careful governess composure, when she had brought Charlotte to the music room to practice the pianoforte and found Alexander there, standing by the windows, and he had turned at their entrance with an expression that might have been loneliness before it shuttered into courtesy, and Charlotte had run to him with uncharacteristic boldness, pulling his hand, begging him to hear how well she could play her scales now, and Eleanor had watched as he allowed himself to be led to a chair, as he sat and listened with an attention that seemed to cost him something, and when Charlotte stumbled through her piece and looked up anxiously, Alexander had smiled, a small thing, barely a curve of his mouth, but it transformed his face entirely, revealed the man he might have been before grief carved out his features, and he had said, "Well done, little one, your mother would have been proud." And Eleanor's heart had performed some acrobatic feat in her chest, had recognized in that moment that she was in terrible danger of forgetting every sensible boundary between employer and employee, between gentleman and governess, between what was possible and what could only ever remain a quiet, unspoken dream. Autumn arrived at Thornfield Manor with its familiar palette of gold and crimson, the gardens surrendering their green to flame-bright leaves that drifted like memories against the mullioned windows, and with the changing season came a crisis that would alter the careful geography of Eleanor's heart in ways she could not have anticipated. Charlotte fell ill in the 3rd week of October, a fever that began as nothing remarkable but climbed with frightening speed through the night until Eleanor found herself at 3 in the morning with a child burning against her chest, delirious and crying for her mother, and the terror that seized Eleanor's chest sent her flying through the corridors in her nightdress and wrapper to pound upon Alexander's chamber door, propriety abandoned in the face of genuine emergency. He had emerged within moments, his shirt half-buttoned and his dark hair disheveled, and the fear that leaped into his eyes when Eleanor gasped out. Her message revealed depths of feeling she had not known he still possessed, and within minutes the household physician had been summoned, the sick room prepared. Cool cloths and willow bark tea and all the remedies available marshalled against the fever's assault, but it was Eleanor and Alexander who kept the vigil through that endless night, and the two that followed, taking turns bathing Charlotte's burning forehead, coaxing her to sip water, reading to her in soft voices during her brief periods of lucidity. And in those lamplit hours when the world narrowed to the small circle of concern around Charlotte's bed, something fundamental shifted between them. They spoke in whispers so as not to disturb the child, conversations that began with medical observations. "Her fever seems lower, do you think?" And she took nearly half the broth, but gradually deepened into territories they had never before explored. And on the second night, when Charlotte had finally fallen into peaceful sleep, and Eleanor sat swaying with exhaustion in the chair beside the bed, Alexander had brought her tea with his own hands and settled into the opposite chair and begun, haltingly, to speak of his late wife, of Isabel, who had been his parents' choice more than his own, a suitable match that had produced a cordial partnership, but never the grand passion poets celebrated, and how he had believed himself content until she had died birthing a stillborn son, and he had been left with the suffocating guilt of having failed to love her as she deserved, of having given her courtesy and respect, but never the whole of his heart. And Eleanor had listened without judgment, without the platitudes others surely offered, simply present with his pain, and when he had finally fallen silent, she had reached across the space between their chairs and placed her hand over his where it gripped the armrest, a touch that lasted only seconds before propriety made her withdraw. But in those seconds something had been acknowledged, some recognition that they were no longer merely master and governess, but two souls who had witnessed each other's fears and found no condemnation there. By the 4th morning, Charlotte's fever broke, the crisis passing as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving them all exhausted and grateful, and when Alexander had looked at Eleanor across Charlotte's sleeping form, his eyes red-rimmed with sleeplessness and damp with relief, he had said simply, "I could not have endured this without you," and Eleanor had felt her heart perform that dangerous leap again, had felt the foundations of her careful professional distance crumbling like autumn leaves returning to earth, and had known with absolute certainty that she was lost, that whatever she had been guarding against had already come to pass, that she loved this broken, complicated man with an intensity that terrified her, precisely because it could never, in any sensible world, be returned. Winter descended upon Thornfield Manor like a benediction, wrapping the estate in silence and snow that muffled the world beyond its walls, and in that crystalline season, Eleanor and Alexander discovered between them a companionship that transcended the boundaries of their respective stations, a meeting of minds and spirits that Eleanor had never dared imagine possible, and which became, in its quiet intensity, both her greatest joy and her most carefully guarded secret. It began with small invitations, Alexander asking if she might join him in the library after Charlotte had been settled for the night, explaining with studied casualness that he had acquired a volume of Wordsworth's latest poems and thought she might appreciate hearing them, and Eleanor had descended those stairs with her heart performing arrhythmic variations, had settled into the chair across from his desk with her hands folded precisely in her lap to keep them from trembling, and had listened as his deep voice rendered the verses with an understanding that revealed dimensions of his soul she had only glimpsed before. The poetry led to philosophy, to discussions of Rousseau and Locke that stretched long past propriety's reasonable hour, Eleanor, discovering that Alexander possessed not merely education, but genuine intellectual curiosity, that he valued her opinions and challenged her thoughts without condescension, treating her observations with the respect he might afford an equal, and she found herself arguing points of logic and ethics with an animation she had not known she possessed, saw his eyes light with pleasure when she made a particularly clever connection, felt the air between them charge with something that had nothing to do with master and governess and everything to do with two minds, recognizing their complement. He taught her chess on evenings when the wind howled against the windows, his hands moving the carved pieces across the board with patient instruction, leaning close to show her the potential paths of attack and defense, and Eleanor struggled to concentrate on strategy when she could feel the warmth of him beside her, when his sleeve brushed hers as he reached across the board, when she could catch the scent of sandalwood and ink that she would forever after associate with these stolen hours. She began reading aloud to him while he attended to estate correspondence, her voice filling the library with tales from Scott and Austen as his pen scratched across ledgers and letters, and sometimes she would glance up to find him motionless, his work forgotten, simply listening to her with an expression of such unguarded contentment that it made her breath catch, made her stumble over words until she could compose herself again. Charlotte noticed the transformation in her uncle, remarked with delight that, "Uncle Alexander smiles now, Miss Hayes, and it's because of you. I'm certain of it." And though Eleanor demurred and redirected the child's attention, privately she allowed herself to hope dangerous, foolish hope that perhaps Charlotte's innocent observation contained some measure of truth. The household staff noticed as well, Mrs. Brennan and the others exchanging knowing glances when Alexander began seeking Eleanor's opinion on matters beyond Charlotte's education, when he asked which arrangements of hothouse flowers she preferred for the dining room, when he ensured that her favorite blend of tea was always available, small attentions that might mean nothing or might mean everything, and Eleanor found herself caught in an exquisite torture of not knowing, of loving him completely while maintaining the fiction of professional distance, her heart fully captured, even as her mind insisted that such dreams could only end in heartbreak for one of her station. Spring came to Thornfield Manor with almost violent beauty, the gardens erupting in riots of colour that seemed to mock the careful restraint Eleanor had maintained through the long winter months, and on an afternoon in late April, when the air hung soft and fragrant with lilac, Alexander sought her out in the rose garden where she sat with Charlotte's watercolours, ostensibly reviewing the child's work, but in truth, simply drinking in the warmth after months of being cloistered indoors, and when his shadow fell across her sketchbook, she looked up to find an expression on his face that made her heart perform that now familiar leap of mingled hope and terror. He asked if she might walk with him, just for a quarter hour, while Charlotte was occupied with her music lesson, and though propriety suggested she should decline, should maintain the boundaries that had grown dangerously thin between them, Eleanor found herself rising, setting aside the watercolours, placing her hand in the crook of his offered arm with a naturalness that felt both entirely right and dangerously presumptuous. They walked in silence at first, following the gravel paths between beds where early roses were just beginning to bud, and Eleanor was acutely conscious of every point where their bodies nearly touched his arm beneath her hand, his shoulder inches from hers, the careful space he maintained that somehow felt more intimate than contact, and she could sense something building in him, could feel it in the tension of his muscles and the way he kept drawing breath as though to speak before releasing it unused. Finally, beside the fountain where stone nymphs poured water into basins that reflected the impossible blue of the April sky, he stopped walking and turned to face her, and Eleanor's breath caught at the intensity in his dark eyes, at the way his hand rose as though to touch her face before he seemed to catch himself, his fingers freezing mere inches from her cheek. "Eleanor," he said, and the sound of her Christian name in his voice, spoken for the first time without the formal address of Miss Hayes, sent heat flooding through her body. "I must tell you, that is, I have tried to resist speaking, but I find I cannot," and Eleanor felt time itself suspend, felt the world narrow to his face and his unfinished sentence, and the terrible, wonderful possibility trembling in the air between them. But at that precise moment, the sound of carriage wheels on gravel shattered the spell, and Alexander's hand dropped, his expression shifting from vulnerable openness to something shuttered and remote so quickly that Eleanor wondered if she had imagined what had hung unspoken between them. They turned together toward the drive where an elegant barouche was pulling up to the manor's entrance, and from it descended a vision of everything. Eleanor was not a woman of obvious breeding and fashion, her traveling dress of emerald silk perfect despite the journey, her golden hair arranged in elaborate coils that had surely required a lady's maid hours to perfect, her bearing proclaiming wealth and position with every graceful movement, and when Alexander murmured, "Lady Catherine Ashford, a family friend," Eleanor heard in his voice a distance that had not been there moments before, felt him already withdrawing from whatever precipice they had approached, and as they walked back toward the house to greet the unexpected visitor, as Eleanor observed how Lady Catherine's face lit with unmistakable warmth at the sight of Alexander, how she extended both hands to him with the confidence of established intimacy, how perfectly she belonged against the backdrop of Thornfield's grandeur in ways that Eleanor, in her simple governess's dress with ink stains on her fingers, never could. She felt the cold weight of reality settling over her foolish heart, understanding with sudden and painful clarity that whatever she had imagined growing between herself and Alexander Blackwood was nothing more than her own desperate fantasy, that she was merely the governess and he was master of all this, and women like Lady Catherine were his proper match, and the almost confession in the garden had been nothing but her own wishful interpretation of ordinary kindness from an employer to a valued servant. Lady Catherine Ashford became a fixture at Thornfield Manor through the weeks that followed, arriving in her elegant carriages with increasing frequency, always beautifully dressed, always bearing some pretext for the visit, a book Alexander had mentioned in passing, an invitation to a society gathering that required his response, a question about estate management that her own late father had handled differently, and Eleanor, observing from her peripheral position in the household, recognized these pretexts for what they were, saw with painful clarity that Catherine was conducting a campaign of courtship with all the strategic precision of a general laying siege, and that the household, from Mrs. Brennan down to the scullery maids, watched this courtship with approval, speaking in hushed tones about how lovely Lady Catherine was, how suitable a match, how wonderful it would be for Charlotte to have a proper lady as mistress of the house, and though no one spoke unkindly to Eleanor, she felt in their carefully neutral glances a gentle pity, an acknowledgement that whatever closeness had developed between herself and the master during the winter months had been nothing more than a temporary aberration, a comfort he had sought in his continued mourning, but which must now give way to appropriate arrangements with women of his own class. She watched from the schoolroom window as Alexander walked the gardens with Catherine, observed the way Catherine's hand rested on his arm with possessive ease, noted how Catherine's laughter carried across the grounds with bell-like clarity, artificial and performance-perfect in ways that Eleanor's own spontaneous mirth had never been, and she witnessed Alexander's careful courtesy, his attentiveness that spoke of breeding and propriety, even if it lacked the warmth he had once shown in those vanished winter evenings. The drawing-room became Catherine's domain, Eleanor carefully timing her passages through the manor to avoid intruding on their tête-à-tête, but occasionally she would be caught, summoned by Alexander's politeness to join them for tea, and these encounters were exquisite torture, Catherine treating her with the particular condescension that certain women of quality reserve for those they consider beneath notice, inquiring about Charlotte's progress with an emphasis on the word progress, that somehow suggested doubt that a governess of Eleanor's background could provide adequate instruction, complimenting Eleanor's dress with a tone that transformed praise into subtle mockery of its simple cut and practical fabric, all while maintaining an expression of such sweet innocence that to take offense would mark Eleanor as oversensitive and ungrateful. Eleanor maintained her composure through these encounters, answered questions about Charlotte's education with professional precision, accepted Catherine's veiled condescension with the grace expected of her position, and if her hands trembled slightly as she set down her teacup, if her voice occasionally wavered on certain words, she trusted that the performance was adequate, that no one could see the way her heart was fracturing beneath her governess's proper exterior. Alexander, she noticed, grew increasingly strained during these encounters, a tension gathering in his shoulders, his responses to Catherine becoming more monosyllabic, his gaze occasionally drifting to Eleanor with an expression she could not decipher. Was it apology, or merely the awkwardness of a man caught between his present attention and his former confidant? Or was she, as always, projecting onto his features emotions that existed only in her own desperate imagination? One afternoon she overheard Alexander's aunt, who had come to stay at the manor, speaking to Mrs. Brennan in voices not quite low enough, discussing how perfect the match was, how Catherine's fortune and connections would restore Thornfield to its former glory, how Alexander needed a woman of strength and society to pull him fully from his melancholy, how it was all proceeding exactly as the family had hoped when they had encouraged Catherine's interest, and Eleanor, frozen in the corridor with her arms full of Charlotte's books, understood then that this courtship was not merely Catherine's campaign, but a family expectation, an arrangement being orchestrated by forces far beyond her power to influence, and that Alexander, whatever confusion or reluctance he might feel, was being drawn inexorably toward a future in which Eleanor Hayes had no place except as a servant who had, for one winter, briefly warmed a cold house before being returned to her proper sphere of inconsequence. The weeks that followed passed in a peculiar suspension of time, each day blurring into the next with the quality of a half-remembered dream, and Eleanor watched as Alexander systematically withdrew from her life, the warmth that had characterized their winter intimacy cooling degree by degree until they had returned to the formal distance of her first months at Thornfield, perhaps even colder for having once known something different. He no longer sought her out in the library during Charlotte's music lessons, no longer appeared in doorways to observe her teaching with that expression of quiet appreciation that had once made her heart flutter, no longer lingered after dinner when she brought Charlotte to say goodnight, instead excusing himself with stiff politeness that felt like a door closing between them, and Eleanor understood, or believed she understood, that he was doing what propriety demanded, what honor required given Lady Catherine's obvious expectations and his family's approval of the match, that whatever had grown between them through those winter months had been an aberration born of his loneliness and her foolish willingness to imagine herself something more than she was. She made her own withdrawal in response, a strategic retreat behind the fortifications of her position, reminding herself with each painful encounter that she was the governess, that she had been hired to educate Charlotte, that any presumption of deeper connection had been her own delusional construction, and she threw herself into her duties with renewed dedication, expanding Charlotte's curriculum, organizing elaborate lessons that kept her occupied from morning until night, leaving no time for the dangerous indulgence of wandering thoughts or wounded feelings. Charlotte, perceptive as children often are to the emotional undercurrents adults believe themselves concealing, grew increasingly distressed by the change, asking Eleanor repeatedly why Uncle Alexander no longer joined them for their evening readings, why they no longer took walks together in the garden, why Eleanor's smiles had become brittle things that never quite reached her eyes, and Eleanor deflected these questions with practiced evasion, speaking of the master's busy schedule and the demands of the estate and Lady Catherine's visits requiring his attention. But Charlotte was not fooled, her small face growing pinched with confusion and a kind of grief that mirrored Eleanor's own hidden anguish. The manor itself seemed to absorb the shift in atmosphere, the warmth that had gradually infused Thornfield through the winter and spring leaching away despite summer's arrival, servants moving through halls with hushed efficiency, the laughter and music that had begun to characterize the household fading back into the respectful silence that had reigned during Eleanor's early months, and she heard Mrs. Brennan remark to the housekeeper that it was like watching the master retreat into his grief again, though this time there seemed to be a different quality to his withdrawal, not the numb sorrow of bereavement, but something more like resignation, a man submitting to necessity rather than surrendering to loss. Eleanor saw him only at a distance now, catching glimpses as he rode out to inspect the estate, observing him through windows as he walked the grounds alone, his posture rigid with what she interpreted as determination to do his duty, regardless of personal preference, and on the rare occasions when their paths crossed directly passing in corridors, meeting accidentally in the breakfast room, encountering each other in the garden when both had sought solitude. The exchanges were so painfully formal that Eleanor felt each word like a small cutting blade, his Miss Hayes and her Mr. Blackwood restoring the barriers that Christian names had briefly dissolved, and if his eyes sometimes lingered on her face with an expression she could not decipher, if his hand sometimes moved as though to reach for her before falling back to his side, she dismissed these observations as wishful thinking. The last desperate attempts of her heart to find hope where none existed, and she hardened herself against such weakness, understanding that the sooner she accepted reality that he would marry Catherine, that Eleanor would remain at Thornfield only as long as her position lasted, that the winter's warmth had been temporary and the coming cold was permanent, the sooner she could begin the long process of learning to live with a heart that would never quite be whole again. Autumn arrived at Thornfield Manor with the same golden melancholy it had carried the previous year, the trees transforming into copper and flame, the air taking on that particular crispness that Eleanor had once found beautiful but now experienced only as a harbinger of approaching winter, and on an October afternoon, when the slanting light painted the drawing room in amber tones, the household staff were summoned with unusual formality, gathered in the great hall with a solemnity that sent whispers rippling through their assembled ranks, and Eleanor stood at the back, with Charlotte's small hand clutched in her own, both of them sensing that whatever announcement was coming would alter the fragile equilibrium they had maintained through the difficult summer months. Alexander entered with his aunt and uncle, his face composed into an expression of calm determination that Eleanor had learned to recognize as his armor against feeling, and beside him walked Lady Catherine Ashford, radiant in rose silk, her smile carrying the particular quality of triumph that precedes the claiming of a long-sought prize, and Eleanor felt her stomach contract with premature knowledge, her body understanding what was coming before her mind could fully articulate the horror of it. The announcement, when it came, was delivered with all the formal precision expected of such occasions. Alexander spoke of his gratitude for the household's loyal service, of the changes coming to Thornfield, of his hope that they would welcome the estate's new mistress with the same dedication they had shown him. And then the words that shattered Eleanor's carefully maintained composure. He and Lady Catherine Ashford were engaged to be married, the wedding to take place in 6 weeks' time, and Eleanor watched as the household erupted in polite applause and murmured congratulations as Mrs. Brennan stepped forward to offer her felicitations, as the staff processed past to express their happiness, and through it all Eleanor remained frozen at the back of the hall, her hand still gripping Charlotte's, her face arranged in what she desperately hoped resembled appropriate pleasure for her employer's happiness, while inside her chest something vital was collapsing, the final, fragile hope she had harbored through all the summer's distance finally extinguishing beneath the weight of this undeniable reality. Charlotte began to cry, not the polite tears of sentimental joy, but deep, wrenching sobs that drew attention from the assembled staff, and Eleanor knelt beside her, whispering desperate attempts at comfort, while her own voice threatened to crack, and she saw Alexander's head turn toward them, saw something flash across his features, pain, regret, something she could not name before Catherine's hand on his arm drew his attention back, and Eleanor understood in that moment that she could not remain at Thornfield, could not watch this marriage unfold, could not witness Catherine taking possession of the rooms and routines and small corners of the manor that Eleanor had, in her foolishness, come to think of as somehow hers. That evening, after she had finally calmed Charlotte enough to sleep, after she had sung lullabies with a voice that kept fracturing on certain notes, after she had promised the child with lies that tasted like ash that everything would be well, that Lady Catherine would be a wonderful addition to their household, Eleanor sat alone in her small room, with her hands pressed against her mouth to muffle the sounds of her weeping, allowing herself this one night of complete collapse, this final acknowledgement of the grief that had been building through months of gradual loss, and she made her decision in those dark hours she would stay until the wedding for Charlotte's sake, would maintain her position and her composure through these final weeks, would attend the ceremony itself as a kind of brutal closure, a witnessing that would force her to accept what her heart still wanted to deny, and then she would leave Thornfield forever, carrying with her the memory of one winter when she had been foolish enough to believe that a governess and a gentleman might overcome the insurmountable distances of class and circumstance, foolish enough to imagine that the warmth in his eyes had meant what her desperate heart had wanted it to mean, foolish enough to love where love could never be returned. The 6 weeks that followed transformed Thornfield Manor into something Eleanor barely recognized. The familiar rooms and corridors overtaken by the elaborate machinery of wedding preparation, and she moved through this altered landscape like a ghost haunting the scenes of her former life. forced to witness each detail of the celebration that would formalize her loss while maintaining the composed demeanor expected of a faithful servant in her employer's household. The great hall was stripped and redecorated, the drawing room rearranged to accommodate the wedding breakfast, the chapel on the estate grounds, which had stood largely unused since Alexander's first wedding, cleaned and adorned with such extravagance that Eleanor could hardly bear to look at it when her duties took her past. The white ribbons and autumn flowers, a painful beauty that seemed to mock her private anguish. And through it all, Lady Catherine moved with the supreme confidence of a woman who had secured exactly what she sought, her presence at Thornfield becoming nearly constant as she involved herself in every decision, every arrangement, claiming her position as mistress even before the vows that would make it legally so. Eleanor endured Catherine's condescension with a patience that surprised even herself, the small cruelties disguised as politeness that characterized their every interaction. Catherine asking Eleanor's opinion on arrangements with a tone that made clear how little that opinion mattered, commenting on how devoted Eleanor was to little Charlotte, with implications that suggested something unwholesome in such attachment, remarking frequently on the appropriate boundaries between servants and family, with pointed looks that left no doubt about her meaning. And Eleanor absorbed these small cuts without visible response, understanding that Catherine sensed some threat in her presence, some awareness that perhaps Alexander's regard had once turned in Eleanor's direction and was now systematically asserting her dominance, marking territory like an animal, ensuring no rival remained. Alexander himself became a figure Eleanor saw only at the greatest distance, and even then only rarely, as though he had arranged his entire existence to ensure their paths would not cross, taking his meals in his study rather than the dining room, conducting his business from the library at hours when he knew Eleanor would be occupied with Charlotte's lessons, leaving the manor entirely on days when wedding preparations required his presence by claiming urgent estate business that kept him away until after dinner, and the few times Eleanor glimpsed him through windows or across crowded rooms, he appeared haggard, his face carrying a strain that she told herself was merely the stress of approaching nuptials, the natural anxiety any man might feel before such a significant life change, though some traitorous part of her heart insisted on reading deeper meanings into the shadows beneath his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the way his gaze seemed to search the rooms he entered as though looking for something he could not find. The household staff moved through their duties with a subdued efficiency that suggested their own complicated feelings about the approaching wedding. Mrs. Brennan's lips pressed into lines of disapproval whenever Catherine issued orders that contradicted long-established household routines, the footman exchanging glances when the lady's demands became particularly imperious, the maids whispering in corners about how different things had been during the winter when the master had seemed almost happy, and Eleanor knew they pitied her even as they could not speak of it directly, their kindness manifesting in small gestures, extra care taken with her meals, her favorite tea appearing without her asking, gentle inquiries about her health that carried unspoken acknowledgement of the suffering they knew she must be enduring. Then came the afternoon, 1 week before the wedding, when Eleanor entered the library seeking a book for Charlotte's literature lesson and found Alexander there, standing at the window with his back to the door, and for a moment neither moved, the silence stretching between them like a physical thing, heavy with 3 years of accumulated feeling and the weight of everything that could not be spoken, and when he finally turned to face her, she saw in his expression such naked anguish that her breath caught. But before either could speak, before she could flee, or he could find words for whatever terrible thing his face suggested, he wanted to say. Catherine's voice echoed from the hall, calling for him, and the moment shattered like glass, Alexander's features composing themselves back into rigid control, his nod of acknowledgement purely formal, and Eleanor retreated with the wrong book clutched in her trembling hands, understanding that this was how it would be, that they would move around each other like wounded planets in separate orbits until the wedding severed even this painful proximity, and she would have to find a way to survive these final days before she could finally, mercifully, leave Thornfield and its ghosts behind forever. The eve of Alexander's wedding arrived, wrapped in the kind of stillness that precedes irrevocable change, the manor holding its breath as the final preparations fell into place, and Eleanor moved through her small room with mechanical precision, folding her modest possessions into the worn trunk that had accompanied her to Thornfield 3 years earlier. her hands steady even as her heart felt like something shattered and poorly mended, barely holding its form. She had secured a position in Scotland, far enough that she would never accidentally hear news of Thornfield, of Alexander and Catherine's life together, of the children they would surely have, the happiness they would build in the rooms where Eleanor had once, foolishly, allowed herself to imagine a different future, and the letter of acceptance lay on her writing desk like a reprieve and a sentence, all at once, promising escape, even as it confirmed the finality of her leaving, the absolute severing of the only place that had ever felt like home. Charlotte had discovered her packing that afternoon and had dissolved into such desperate tears that Eleanor had been forced to abandon her task entirely, gathering the child in her arms and rocking her as she wept. And Charlotte's anguished questions, "Why must you go? Don't you love us anymore? How can I bear it?" Without you had pierced Eleanor's composure until she too was weeping, the two of them clinging to each other in shared grief over losses they could not properly name. And Eleanor had promised to write, had promised that Charlotte would always hold a special place in her heart, had offered every comfort she could summon while carefully avoiding the truth that she was fleeing not because she loved them too little, but because she loved one of them far, far too much. Now, in the deep hours of night when the household slept and tomorrow's ceremony waited like an executioner's appointment, Eleanor sat at her window watching the moon paint silver across the grounds she had walked so often, and she allowed herself the dangerous indulgence of remembering every conversation by the library fire, every chess game where their hands had nearly touched over the pieces, every moment when his eyes had met hers with an intensity that had made her breath catch, every small kindness and consideration that had fed the hope she now recognized as her fatal error. Had she imagined the regard she thought she had seen in his face that winter? Had she constructed an entire fantasy from ordinary politeness, from the natural warmth any decent man might show to the woman educating his beloved niece? She replayed each treasured memory with ruthless scrutiny, trying to separate truth from wishful interpretation, trying to understand how she had allowed herself to believe, even briefly, that a man of Alexander Blackwood's station might love someone of her circumstance, and the more she examined those memories, the more confused she became, because even now, even knowing tomorrow he would pledge himself to another, she could not fully convince herself that what she had seen in his eyes had been mere kindness, could not entirely dismiss the weight of those long silences between them, the way his voice had softened when he spoke her name, the 100 small moments that had felt like the architecture of something real and mutual and true. But it did not matter now what had been real or imagined, did not matter whether he had felt some pale reflection of what had consumed her heart so completely, because in the morning he would marry Lady Catherine Ashford, and Eleanor would bear witness to that irrevocable act, would sit in the chapel and watch him speak, vows that ended all speculation, all desperate hope, all foolish dreams, and she had decided this watching was necessary, a kind of violence she must do to her own heart to force acceptance of what her stubborn hope kept trying to deny. She would attend the wedding, would see it through to its bitter conclusion, would let the reality of his marriage scar itself into her memory so deeply that no amount of distance or time could let her forget that Alexander Blackwood had been lost to her, had perhaps never been hers to lose, and only then, with that final witnessing complete, would she permit herself to leave Thornfield, to begin the long process of learning to live, with the particular grief of loving someone who stood forever just beyond reach, close enough to have known, too far to ever truly hold. The morning arrived with that particular quality of autumn light that seems to render everything both beautiful and melancholy at once. And Eleanor dressed with the mechanical precision of someone preparing for an ordeal rather than a celebration, her hands fastening the buttons of her plainest grey dress, appropriately inconspicuous for a governess attending her employer's wedding, while her face in the mirror appeared pale and resolute, a woman steeling herself for necessary pain. The chapel bells began their call as she descended the servants' stairs, avoiding the main corridors where wedding guests would be arriving in their finery, and she slipped into the small chapel through the side entrance, taking a position in the very last pew, where shadows gathered thick, and she might observe without being observed, where she might bear witness to this final scene and then disappear as quietly as she had come. The chapel filled gradually with the rustle of silk and the murmur of polite conversation, society's finest assembled to watch the union of two of their own, and Eleanor kept her eyes downcast as they entered, these lords and ladies who moved through a world she had only ever glimpsed from its margins. But when the processional music swelled, and she finally raised her gaze, when Alexander entered and took his position at the altar, with Catherine's brother standing as his attendant, Eleanor felt the full weight of what she was about to witness settle upon her chest like a stone. She studied his face with the desperate attention of someone committing final details to memory, searching those beloved features for some sign of what he felt in this moment. Was that tension in his jaw strain, or merely the solemnity appropriate to the occasion? Did his eyes hold doubt, or did she only project her own desperate hope onto his carefully composed expression? He looked distinguished in his formal attire, his dark hair touched with silver at the temples, his bearing that of a man fulfilling his duty to family and society, and Eleanor tried to find in that composed exterior any hint of the man who had laughed with her over chess, who had shared his deepest grief during Charlotte's illness, who had looked at her across the library with an intensity that had made her believe, foolishly, that perhaps his heart moved in rhythm with her own. Then Catherine entered, a vision of triumphant beauty in ivory silk and Brussels lace, her smile radiant with the confidence of a woman who had secured exactly what she sought, and Eleanor watched Alexander's face as his bride approached, searching for joy, for love, for any emotion beyond the careful blankness he wore like armor, but she could read nothing in those shuttered features, nothing that told her whether this marriage was his heart's desire or merely his resignation to duty's demands. The ceremony began, the minister's voice rolling through the chapel with the ancient words that had bound countless couples before, and Eleanor felt the room begin to waver slightly, the edges of her vision growing soft and distant, her corset suddenly too tight, her breath coming shallow and quick as the reality of what was happening pressed down upon her with suffocating weight. This was truly occurring. He was truly marrying another, and in moments the vows would be spoken that would place him forever beyond her reach, would transform him from the man she loved into another woman's husband, and she would have to find some way to live with the particular agony of having been so close to him, of having known the warmth of his regard even if she had misunderstood its nature, of having loved him with her whole heart while remaining forever invisible, forever impossible, forever the governess who had dared to dream above her station and would now pay the price of that presumption in years of quiet, endless grief. The minister's voice swelled with the weight of sacred ritual as he began the vows that would bind Alexander and Catherine in matrimony, the words rolling through the chapel with inexorable momentum. "Wilt thou have this woman to thy wedded wife, to live together after God's ordinance in the holy estate of matrimony?" And Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her feet, felt the air grow thick and impossible to draw into her lungs, felt a roaring in her ears that drowned out everything except the thundering recognition that she could not bear witness to his answer, could not sit here and watch him speak the words that would end all hope, all possibility, all the desperate, foolish dreams she had harbored, despite knowing better. She rose as quietly as she could manage, her legs unsteady beneath her, intending to slip out through the side door before the vows were exchanged, thinking perhaps she could spare herself this final cruelty, perhaps she had been wrong to believe she needed this witnessing, perhaps some mercies were meant to be accepted rather than refused. But the movement of standing sent the chapel spinning violently around her, the candlelight blurring into streaks of gold against the stone walls, and she reached for the pew back to steady herself, even as she felt her grip on consciousness beginning to slip like water through her fingers. The minister continued, oblivious, "Wilt thou love her, comfort her, honor and keep her, in sickness and in health?" And Eleanor took one wavering step toward the aisle, her vision narrowing to a small tunnel of clarity, surrounded by encroaching darkness, her corset constricting around ribs that would not expand properly, her heart hammering against her breastbone with a violence that seemed certain to shatter something vital, and she thought with strange detachment that she was going to faint, that her body was simply refusing to sustain the weight of what her heart was being asked to endure, that after 3 years of careful control and hidden emotion, her physical form was staging its own rebellion against the tyranny of necessary silence. She never felt herself hit the floor, never registered the moment when her body surrendered entirely to the overwhelming tide. But the sound of her fall echoed through the chapel like a gunshot, a sharp crack of bone and wood that silenced the minister mid-word and sent a collective gasp rippling through the assembled guests, heads turning in unified motion, toward the back of the chapel, where Eleanor lay, crumpled in the aisle like a broken bird, her grey dress pooled around her, one arm flung out as if reaching for something forever beyond her grasp, her face pale as death against the dark stone. Time seemed to suspend itself in that breathless moment, the entire congregation frozen in tableau, Catherine at the altar with her bouquet raised halfway to her breast, the minister with his prayer book still open, the guests half risen from their seats in shock, and in that suspension of ordinary time, Alexander turned his head, slowly, inexorably, following the sound of the fall, and when his eyes found Eleanor's collapsed form, his face underwent a transformation so complete and devastating that anyone watching could not mistake its meaning, could not fail to understand in that single unguarded instant exactly what she meant to him, what she had always meant, what he had been trying desperately to deny through months of withdrawal, and the terrible mistake of this day. The color drained from his features as though his very blood had fled in horror at what he was witnessing, his carefully maintained composure shattering like glass, and without thought, without hesitation, without any regard for the ceremony he was abandoning, or the woman waiting at the altar, or the scandal he was about to create, Alexander moved. He moved with a swiftness that sent his formal coat billowing behind him like dark wings, his carefully polished shoes striking the stone floor in rapid percussion as he abandoned the altar without a word, without explanation, without any of the civilized pretense that had governed his actions for 3 years of careful restraint. And Catherine's voice rose sharply behind him. "Alexander, Alexander, what are you doing?" The shock and outrage in her tone cutting through the chapel's stunned silence. But he did not turn, did not acknowledge her, did not slow his determined stride down the aisle toward where Eleanor lay motionless against the cold stone, and the assembled guests erupted in scandalized whispers that swelled like a wave, their collective shock manifesting in gasps and murmurs and the rustle of expensive fabric as people half rose from their seats, to witness this unprecedented breach of propriety, this abandonment of a bride at the altar, this public confession, written in action rather than words. Alexander reached Eleanor's side and dropped to his knees beside her, with no regard for his wedding finery, his hands moving to her face with a tenderness so profound that it silenced even the whispers, his fingers trembling slightly as he touched her pale cheek, as he brushed back the dark hair that had come loose from its pins, as he felt for the pulse at her throat with the desperate focus of a man confirming that what he valued most in this world still lived and breathed. And when he found that steady beat beneath his fingertips, his eyes closed briefly in relief, so naked that several women in the nearest pews pressed handkerchiefs to their lips, recognizing in that unguarded moment the truth of what they were witnessing. This was not duty, not propriety, not the careful alliance that his engagement to Catherine had represented, but rather love in its most essential and undeniable form, the kind of love that obliterates all other considerations and renders everything else meaningless in comparison. He gathered Eleanor into his arms with infinite care, one hand cradling her head against his chest, the other sliding beneath her knees, lifting her as though she were made of glass and might shatter if handled roughly. And as he rose to his full height with her slight weight held close against his heart, his face underwent another transformation, the careful mask he had worn for months, dissolving completely to reveal something raw and true, beneath not the composed gentleman, not the grieving widower, not the dutiful aristocrat fulfilling society's expectations, but simply a man holding the woman he loved, a man who had nearly made the greatest mistake of his life and was being granted an unexpected chance to choose differently, and the revelation washing over his features was so complete that even those who had known him for decades suddenly understood they had never truly seen him until this moment, had never witnessed what he looked like when he allowed himself to feel without restraint, to need without apology, to love without the burden of propriety's chains. His eyes remained fixed on Eleanor's unconscious face with an intensity that made everything else in the chapel, the flowers, the candles, the minister still standing, frozen with his prayer book, the bride abandoned at the altar, the guests rising now in waves of shock, fade into irrelevance. And as he turned toward the chapel doors, as he began walking with measured steps that nevertheless conveyed urgency, carrying Eleanor toward air and light and away from the ceremony that would have bound him to the wrong woman for all his remaining years, the tenderness in his touch and the devotion written across his face told a story more eloquent than any vows could have spoken, declared a truth more binding than any ceremony could have sealed, and everyone watching understood with crystalline clarity that they were witnessing not a scandal, but rather a salvation, not the destruction of one wedding, but the first necessary step toward the only marriage that had ever truly mattered. Alexander moved toward the chapel doors with Eleanor cradled against his chest, his steps measured and deliberate despite the urgency written in every line of his body, and the silence that had momentarily fallen over the congregation shattered completely as he passed, erupting into a cacophony of shocked whispers and scandalized gasps that rose like a flock of startled birds, the sound filling the vaulted space with the evidence of society's outrage. But Alexander's face remained fixed in an expression of such focused determination that it was clear he heard none of it, registered none of the chaos he was creating, aware only of the precious weight in his arms and the faint flutter of her breath against his throat that told him she lived, she breathed, she remained within reach of whatever words he desperately needed to speak before this moment passed and propriety reasserted its terrible tyranny. Catherine's voice cut through the din with the sharp edge of fury and humiliation. "How dare you, Alexander Blackwood? You come back here this instant." But he did not pause, did not turn, did not acknowledge the woman he had left standing at the altar in her white gown and orange blossoms, and the cut of that dismissal, the absolute completeness of his disregard, spoke more eloquently than any explanation could have done, declared with brutal clarity that whatever obligation or expectation had brought him to that altar, it was dust compared to what he felt for the woman he now carried toward the light. The guests parted before him like water, shrinking back from the intensity of his focus, and their faces reflected every shade of shocked dowagers, clutching their pearls in genuine scandal, young ladies pressing gloved hands to their mouths with expressions caught between horror and secret delight at such dramatic romance, gentlemen exchanging significant looks that suggested they understood more than they would ever speak aloud, and through it all the whispers multiplied and transformed, speculation spreading like wildfire through the assembly, rewriting the narrative they thought they knew, recognizing that they had witnessed not a proper alliance, but rather a tragedy narrowly averted. Alexander reached the chapel doors and shouldered through them without breaking stride, carrying Eleanor out into the autumn afternoon where the air was crisp and clean and filled with the scent of turning leaves, the sunlight falling through the ancient oaks in dappled patterns that seemed blessedly real after the suffocating atmosphere of the chapel, and his voice emerged rough with emotion as he called out, "Water, bring water. Send for Dr. Morrison immediately." The commands directed at no one and everyone, and servants who had been waiting outside came running, their faces reflecting concern rather than judgment, for they had known Eleanor these 3 years, had loved her for her kindness and her warmth, and whatever scandal this moment represented mattered less to them than her welfare. Eleanor stirred in his arms as the fresh air reached her, her eyelids fluttering, a small sound escaping her lips that might have been his name or might have been simply the vocalization of returning consciousness, and Alexander looked down at her with such naked emotion that a maid approaching with water actually faltered in her steps, suddenly feeling she was intruding on something too intimate for witnessing, and he shifted Eleanor's weight slightly, adjusting his hold so that he cradled her more securely, his face lowering toward hers as he murmured words too quiet for anyone else to hear. "Eleanor, come back. Please come back to me. I cannot lose you. I will not lose you." And her eyes opened slowly, focusing with difficulty, confusion clouding her features until she registered where she was, who held her, and then understanding flooded her expression, followed immediately by mortification and something that looked desperately like hope, struggling against the weight of 3 years' resignation, and their eyes met in that suspended moment, his dark with everything he had never allowed himself to say, hers wide with everything she had never allowed herself to believe possible, and in the space between one heartbeat and the next, everything unspoken finally became visible, finally became real, finally became impossible to deny or dismiss or explain away as anything other than what it had always been: love, profound and patient, and finally given permission to exist in the light. Alexander carried Eleanor into the small morning room adjacent to the chapel, shouldering the door closed behind them with finality that shut out the chaos and scandal and shocked voices, creating a sanctuary where only truth could exist, and he lowered her with infinite gentleness onto the velvet settee near the window, where autumn light fell in golden streams across the Persian carpet, Kneeling beside her as a servant appeared with water and smelling salts, hovering uncertainly until Alexander took the glass with a quiet, "Thank you, leave us," that brooked no argument. And when the door clicked shut, Eleanor struggled to sit upright despite her spinning head, mortification flooding her features as the full reality of what had transpired crashed over her consciousness. She had fainted at his wedding, had created the most appalling scene, had ruined everything, had exposed herself in the most humiliating fashion imaginable, and her voice emerged trembling and small as she tried to stand, tried to escape before she could cause any more damage. "I am so sorry. I don't know what happened. Please, I must go. You must return to the ceremony, to Catherine. I have already caused such terrible—" But Alexander's hands caught hers, held them with a desperation that stopped her words mid-flight, and he was shaking his head, his dark eyes fierce and bright, with something that looked dangerously like tears barely held in check, and the dam that had held back 3 years of careful restraint finally, irrevocably broke. "No," he said, the word emerging rough and raw. "No, Eleanor, you will not apologize, you will not leave. I will not let you go. Not again. Not when I have been the greatest fool who ever drew breath. Not when I have spent 3 years denying the only truth that has ever mattered, believing myself noble when I was only a coward, thinking I was protecting you when I was only protecting myself from the risk of rejection, from the possibility that you could never care for a man so broken, so haunted by past failures, so unworthy of the light you bring to every room you enter." And the confession poured from him like water from a broken dam, words tumbling over each other in his urgency, to make her understand before the moment passed, before propriety could reassert itself and steal this chance. He had been too blind to seize when it was freely offered. "I thought myself dishonoring you with my regard," he continued, his hands tightening around hers as though she might vanish if he loosened his grip. "I am 15 years your senior, a widower with shadows in every corner of his heart, a man who failed his first wife so completely that she died believing herself unloved. And you are light and warmth and everything good, and I could not bear the thought of dimming that brightness with my darkness, could not imagine you would ever see me as anything other than your employer. And when Catherine appeared, when everyone spoke of how suitable she was, how appropriate the match, I thought perhaps that was my answer, that I should accept what was proper and expected, rather than reach for what I truly wanted, that I should let you go free to find someone worthy of you, someone who could give you the life you deserve." And his voice broke slightly on the last words, revealing the depth of pain that 3 years of self-imposed restraint had cost him. Eleanor's eyes had gone wide with shock, tears spilling unchecked down her pale cheeks as she listened to him reshape everything she had believed about the past 3 years. And Alexander lifted one hand to her face, his thumb brushing away the wetness with a tenderness that made her breath catch, and he continued more quietly now, his voice dropping to something intimate and desperate. "But when I saw you fall, when I watched you collapse and thought for one terrible moment that I might lose you entirely, everything became crystalline clear. Nothing else matters, Eleanor. Not propriety, not society's expectations, not the difference in our stations or ages, not my unworthiness or my fears. Nothing matters except the truth that I have loved you from the moment you brought laughter back to this house, and I cannot marry Catherine when my heart has belonged entirely to you for 3 years of silent devotion." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat as the full weight of his words settled over her. 3 years of silent resignation cracking apart like ice under sudden spring thaw, and her tears fell faster now, not from grief but from the overwhelming collision of hope and disbelief, from the violence of having her entire understanding of the past rewritten in a single confession, and her voice emerged trembling and broken as she tried to speak through the emotion that threatened to choke her. "You loved me? All this time, you loved me?" And the wonder in her words, the aching vulnerability, made Alexander's own eyes glisten with unshed tears as he nodded, his hand still cradling her face with a tenderness that spoke of years of restraint finally released, and Eleanor's own hand rose to cover his, pressing it more firmly against her cheek, as though to anchor herself to this moment before it could dissolve into dream or delusion. And her words tumbled out in their own rush of confession, no longer capable of containing what 3 years of silence had compressed into painful density. "I have loved you since that first winter," she said, her voice gaining strength even as it shook with emotion. Since those nights watching over Charlotte, when you spoke of your past, your pain, and I saw beneath the careful distance you maintained to the man who felt everything so deeply that he had buried his heart to survive the loss of it. And I thought, I hoped, perhaps foolishly, that something was growing between us, that the conversations by the fire and the shared silences in the library meant to you what they meant to me. But then Catherine arrived, and you withdrew so completely that I knew I had been mistaken, that I had allowed myself to imagine regard where there was only kindness toward an employee. And how could there be more? I am a governess, Alexander, a woman of no family or fortune or standing, and you are. You are everything I could never aspire to equal, and I thought myself the greatest fool for allowing my heart to fix itself on an impossibility, for reading romance into what was merely your natural courtesy, for believing that a man like you could ever see a woman like me as anything other than a useful servant who had the additional merit of making his niece happy. Her words struck Alexander like physical blows, pain washing across his features at the revelation of how completely they had misunderstood each other, how perfectly their fears had conspired to keep them apart, how close they had come to losing everything to the tyranny of propriety and assumed unworthiness. And he shook his head slowly, both hands now framing her face as though she were something infinitely precious and infinitely fragile. And his voice was hoarse with regret as he spoke. Eleanor, your birth and position mean nothing to me, less than nothing. They are mere accidents of circumstance, while your character, your warmth, your extraordinary capacity for compassion and joy, these are the things that matter. These are what make you worthy of far better than a haunted widower who has wasted 3 years in cowardice when he should have been honest, from the first moment he realized his heart had been captured. And Eleanor's hands rose to grip his wrists, holding him to her as tears continued to stream down her face. And she could see in his eyes that he spoke absolute truth, that the barriers she had believed insurmountable existed only in her own imagination, only in the poisonous whispers of a society that valued bloodlines over souls. And the joy rising in her chest was so fierce it felt almost painful. 3 years of compressed longing, finally given permission to expand and breathe and exist in the light of day. "Kiss me," she whispered, the words barely audible but carrying the weight of every moment they had denied themselves, every glance that had lingered too long and been forcibly cut short, every accidental touch that had sent lightning through both their bodies and been apologized away. And Alexander's eyes darkened with an answering hunger that had been banked for far too long, and he leaned forward with a slowness that suggested reverence, that spoke of savoring rather than seizing, and their lips met in a kiss that was at once desperate and tender, homecoming and discovery, apology and forgiveness and promise all woven together in the pressure of mouth against mouth. And Eleanor's hands slid into his dark hair while his arms encircled her waist, pulling her closer as 3 years of restraint dissolved into this single point of perfect contact. And the kiss deepened as they both surrendered to what had always been true, what had always been inevitable despite all their careful attempts to deny it. And when they finally drew apart, both breathing unsteadily, Alexander rested his forehead against hers and whispered with absolute conviction, "I am yours, Eleanor Hayes. I have been yours since you brought light back to this house, and I will spend the rest of my life proving myself worthy of the extraordinary gift of your love." The world beyond the morning room door could not be held at bay forever, and reality reasserted itself gradually through the sounds, filtering through the walls, raised voices, the clatter of carriages being called, the unmistakable timbre of Catherine's fury cutting through the general commotion like a blade through silk, and Eleanor stiffened in Alexander's arms, the joy of the previous moments shadowed suddenly by the dawning awareness of what his choice would cost him, what scandal would attach itself to both their names, how society would condemn him for the public humiliation of a woman like Catherine Ashford, how she would be painted as a scheming opportunist who had seduced her employer, and her voice emerged, small and frightened as she pulled back slightly to meet his eyes. "Alexander, what have we done? Catherine, the guests, your reputation, the scandal will be tremendous. Everyone will say," but he silenced her with another kiss, brief and firm, then drew back with an expression of such calm resolution that it seemed impossible he had just abandoned his own wedding in the most spectacular fashion imaginable, and his voice was steady as granite when he spoke, the voice of a man who had finally found his true north and would not be swayed from it by any storm society could conjure. "Let them say what they will," he declared, his hands still framing her face as though to keep her anchored to him, to prevent her from fleeing under the weight of propriety's judgment. "I will not marry without love, Eleanor. I will not condemn us both to a lifetime of separated misery, simply to satisfy society's expectations, or to preserve reputations built on nothing more substantial than accident of birth. I have lived 3 years in cowardice, and it has brought nothing but suffering to us both, and I will not waste another moment pretending that happiness lies in the direction of duty rather than love. Catherine will recover from the embarrassment. Her pride is wounded, but not her heart, for she never loved me any more than I loved her. We were a suitable arrangement and nothing more. And as for the guests and their scandalized whispers, they will find some new source of gossip within a fortnight, and we will be yesterday's entertainment. But if I let you go now, if I allow fear of judgment to separate us again, that is a wound that will never heal. That is a loss from which neither of us would recover." Eleanor's eyes searched his face, looking for any shadow of doubt or hesitation, any sign that his certainty might waver under the pressure that would surely come, but she found only steady determination and something fiercer, a willingness to burn down every bridge to propriety if that was what love required. And even as fear still whispered its warnings in her mind, hope began to overpower it, began to believe that perhaps they truly could weather whatever storm was coming, and before she could respond, the door burst open without ceremony, and Catherine stood on the threshold in all her bridal magnificence, her face contorted with a fury that made her beauty savage, and her voice shaking with outrage as she spat. "How dare you humiliate me in such a fashion? How dare you leave me standing at the altar like some jilted fool while you run after your governess? The scandal of this will ruin you, Alexander. It will destroy whatever standing you have left. And for what? For her?" The last word dripping with such contempt that Eleanor flinched despite Alexander's protective presence, but he rose smoothly to his feet, placing himself between Catherine and Eleanor with a deliberateness that spoke louder than words about where his loyalty now resided, and his voice when he addressed his former bride-to-be was gentle but absolutely immovable, carrying the weight of a decision from which there would be no retreat. "Catherine, you have my sincerest apologies for the manner of this. You deserved honesty far earlier than this moment. But I cannot and will not marry you when my heart belongs irrevocably to another. You deserve a husband who loves you as you should be loved, and I am not that man. I never was, and remaining silent would have been a far greater cruelty than this public acknowledgement of truth." And Catherine's face cycled through shock and rage before settling into something colder, more calculating, and she drew herself up with wounded dignity and delivered her parting shot with precision. "You will both be ruined for this. Society will never accept her, never forgive you. You are throwing away everything for a woman who can bring you nothing but shame." And then she swept from the room in a rustle of silk and fury, and in the silence that followed, Alexander turned back to Eleanor and took her hands again and repeated with quiet fierceness, "Nothing else matters. I will not live without you again. Whatever comes, we will face it together." 3 months passed before the manor's small chapel witnessed another wedding, but this time the guest list numbered barely 20 souls, only those whose love was genuine and whose presence was desired rather than obligated. And the contrast between this intimate gathering and the grand spectacle that had nearly been could not have been more profound, for where Catherine's planned ceremony had been all ostentation and society performance, this was stripped to its essential truth. 2 people who had found each other against all odds, finally claiming the happiness they had nearly lost to fear and propriety. The autumn light filtered through the chapel's ancient stained glass in jeweled streams of amber and crimson, casting patterns across the stone floor, where Eleanor stood in a simple gown of ivory silk, no elaborate train or excessive ornamentation, just clean lines that spoke of elegance rather than display, and her hair was dressed with late-season roses from the manor's gardens, the same gardens where Alexander had nearly confessed his heart 2 years prior, and the symbolism was not lost on either of them as he stood waiting at the altar, the same altar where he had stood before. But how different he looked now, how transformed. The tension that had made him appear carved from marble entirely absent, replaced by a warmth that radiated from him like heat from summer stones, and his eyes never left Eleanor's face as she walked toward him on the arm of the kindly vicar who had known her since her arrival at Thornfield, who had watched the whole painful drama unfold, and who now beamed with the satisfaction of seeing justice finally served. Charlotte preceded Eleanor as flower girl, scattering petals with such enthusiasm that several guests laughed despite the solemnity of the occasion, and the child's joy was perhaps the purest element of the entire ceremony, for she had been the innocent victim of the adults' complicated denials, and now she radiated happiness at seeing the two people she loved most finally united, as they should have been from the start. The household staff lined the pews, Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper, dabbing at her eyes with her apron, Thomas, the butler, maintaining his dignity but unable to suppress his smile, the kitchen maids whispering excitedly. Despite the setting, all of them vindicated in their long-held belief that the master and the governess belonged together, and their presence spoke of family rather than mere employment, of bonds that transcended the formal boundaries between master and servant. When Eleanor reached the altar and Alexander took her hands, the vicar's words seemed to fade into background music, for what mattered was not the ceremony but what lay beneath it. The vows they were speaking with their eyes before their lips gave voice to them. The promise that this time there would be no withdrawal, no surrender to fear, no allowing society's judgment to override the testimony of their own hearts. Alexander's voice was steady and clear as he spoke his vows, each word weighted with the conviction of a man who had nearly lost everything and now held his whole world in his hands, and Eleanor's voice, though quieter, carried the same absolute certainty, the same sense of homecoming, and when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and Alexander drew her into their first kiss as a married couple, the small chapel erupted in applause and Charlotte's delighted squeal, and the sound was nothing like the polite appreciation that would have greeted his kiss with Catherine. This was genuine joy, uncomplicated celebration, love witnessing love and recognizing itself. The celebration that followed was held in the manor's great hall, transformed not by expensive decorations, but by the simple abundance of candlelight and the season's harvest flowers, and their first dance was to music played by the village musicians rather than a hired orchestra, and somehow it was more perfect for its simplicity, more true, and as Alexander held Eleanor in his arms, and they moved together to the gentle melody, he whispered against her hair, "I am home at last," and she understood completely, for she, too, had found in him the home she had sought all her life, not a place but a person, not shelter but belonging. And as the evening progressed, and she found herself laughing at something Thomas said, catching Charlotte as she spun past in overexcited circles, accepting congratulations from guests whose affection was genuine rather than performed, Eleanor felt the last traces of the past 3 years' pain finally dissolve, transmuted by joy into something almost precious, for the suffering had led here, to this moment, to this man, to this life, and she would not trade the journey for anything, would not wish away the pain that had made this happiness so luminous by contrast. And when she and Alexander finally retired to their chambers as the celebration continued below, she turned in his arms and whispered, "Thank you for being brave enough to choose love." And his kiss was his answer, deep and claiming and infinitely tender, and the rooms that had once known only silence and grief now rang with Eleanor's laughter, with their shared whispers, with the sound of love, finally given voice and space and permission to exist without apology or restraint. 5 years passed like water flowing smoothly over riverstones, each season polishing the rough edges of scandal, until what remained was simply the story of Thornfield Manor's master and his beloved wife, and the estate that had once been a mausoleum of grief transformed utterly into something alive and radiant, children's voices echoing through halls that had known only silence, Eleanor and Alexander's 2 sons joining Charlotte, who had grown into a thoughtful young woman of 16, and the sound of their family was a symphony of belonging that erased all memory of the cold years before Eleanor's arrival. On an autumn afternoon, much like the one that had witnessed both a near tragedy and a salvation, Eleanor stood in the manor's library, the same library where she had once stolen glances at Alexander while pretending to search for books, where they had shared their first tentative conversations about poetry and philosophy. And she held their youngest son on her hip, while the older boy played with wooden soldiers at her feet, and Alexander entered as he so often did, pausing in the doorway, not from distance now, but simply to savor the sight of his family, and the smile that creased his face was the smile of a man who had learned that happiness was not betrayal of past sorrows, but their redemption. And when he crossed to gather them all in his arms, Eleanor caught his eye, and saw reflected there the same wonder she still felt that they had found each other, that they had been brave enough to claim this joy despite every obstacle society and fear had placed in their path, that the moment of her fainting and his choosing had opened the door to this life they now lived. Charlotte appeared in the doorway with her governess, for she was preparing for her debut in society, though she had declared firmly that she would accept no suitor who did not love her as her uncle loved her aunt, and the girl's happiness was perhaps the greatest testament to the rightness of the choice Alexander had made, for she had blossomed under the warmth of a household built on genuine love rather than cold propriety. And as the family gathered for tea in the drawing-room where Eleanor had once served in the peripheral position of hired help, now sitting beside Alexander as his equal and partner, she reflected on the strange journey that had brought them here and how close they had come to losing it all to silence and fear. But now, dear listener, dear heart, as this story draws to its close, let me speak to you directly about what lives at the center of this tale, for it is not merely a romance between a governess and her employer, not simply a dramatic rescue from a fainting spell, though it is those things too, but rather it is a testimony to the courage required to honor the truth of one's own heart, even when that truth contradicts every expectation society has placed upon you. It is about the transformations that become possible when we choose vulnerability over protection, authentic feeling over proper performance, the uncertain joy of real love over the hollow security of suitable arrangements. Eleanor and Alexander's story reminds us that the most profound connection cannot be denied forever, that love suppressed does not disappear but rather poisons everything it touches with the ache of its absence, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is speak the truth we have been taught to hide, reach for the hand we have been told is not ours to hold, choose the life that makes us whole rather than the one that makes us acceptable. How many of us, I wonder, have stood in Eleanor's position, loving from the shadows, believing our feelings inappropriate or impossible, convinced that silence is the nobler choice, or in Alexander's place, withdrawing from what we most desire because we have decided for others what they could never want, punishing ourselves and those we love with a propriety that serves no one? The years they lost to fear and assumption were not inevitable but chosen, moment by moment, in every conversation not spoken, every touch not offered, every truth not confessed, and while we cannot reclaim lost time, we can learn from their near tragedy to risk our hearts more bravely, to trust that love honestly expressed, even if unreturned, is worthier than love silently suffered, to understand that the scandal of authentic feeling is far less destructive than the slow death of emotional dishonesty. So if you find yourself loving in secret, believing your affection unwelcome or inappropriate, consider whether you truly know the other's heart or have merely assumed its contents, and if you are withdrawing from connection out of nobility, ask whether that nobility serves love or only serves fear, and if you are choosing the suitable path over the true one, remember that a lifetime is too long to spend in the wrong story, playing the wrong part, denying the self you were meant to become. May you find the courage to speak when silence seems safer, to reach when withdrawal seems proper, to choose the love that transforms over the arrangement that merely satisfies expectation, and may your heart know the peace that comes not from avoiding pain, but from living authentically, not from perfect safety, but from perfect truth. And may you rest tonight knowing that somewhere, in a manor filled with the laughter of children and the warmth of genuine love, Eleanor and Alexander still walk hand in hand through autumn gardens, still grateful for the fainting spell that finally shattered their silence, still choosing each other every day, and may their story whisper to you in the quiet moments, be brave, dear heart, be true, for love is always worth the risk, and the life that waits on the other side of courage is more beautiful than any you could construct from fear.